Robert Thompson stood at the vast window of his Manhattan penthouse, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars against the evening sky. The crystal tumbler in his hand held aged scotch, worth more than what most people made in a month, yet he barely tasted it. At 65, having recently retired from his position as CEO of Thompson Industries, he found himself trapped in a peculiar kind of poverty, not of wealth, but of purpose. The silence in his luxurious apartment was deafening. Every surface gleamed with expensive finishes, every piece of furniture carefully selected by interior designers, yet none of it filled the void that had been growing since his retirement 3 months ago. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years earlier, and their only son, James, lived in Europe, too busy with his own life to do more than make obligatory holiday calls. Another riveting evening of staring at the wall, sir? Jenkins, his butler of 20 years, appeared silently at his elbow with fresh ice for his drink. Robert allowed himself a small smile. Jenkins was the closest thing he had to a friend these days, though their relationship was constrained by professional boundaries. "You know me too well, Jenkins. Tell me, what do people do when they have everything and nothing at the same time?" Jenkins paused, his usually stoic expression softening slightly. "If I may speak freely, sir, perhaps the problem isn't having everything, but rather what you're doing with it." The words struck Robert harder than he expected. What was he doing with his wealth, his time, his life? Sure, he made the obligatory donations to charities, attended the necessary galas, but when was the last time he'd actually done something meaningful? His thoughts were interrupted by a news segment playing on the muted television. The headline caught his eye: "Local hospital faces staff shortages." The camera panned across familiar scenes of Mount Sinai Hospital, where Margaret had spent her final days. The memories flooded back: the sterile corridors, the beeping machines, the dedication of the staff who had made her last moments as comfortable as possible. "Jenkins," Robert said suddenly, setting down his glass, "what would you say if I told you I was thinking of becoming a hospital volunteer?" The butler's eyebrows rose slightly, the equivalent of shocked surprise in his carefully controlled expression. "I would say it's the most interesting thing you've said in months, sir." The next morning, Robert found himself in the volunteer coordinator's office at Mount Sinai, feeling oddly out of place in his casual clothes. A concession to Jenkins' advice that his usual bespoke suits might be intimidating. The coordinator, a warm-faced woman named Sarah Chen, looked at his application with poorly concealed surprise. "Mr. Thompson, your background is quite impressive," she said diplomatically. "But I have to ask, why do you want to volunteer here? We usually get students, retirees looking for social interaction." "I am a retiree," Robert pointed out, attempting humor. When she didn't smile, he sighed and decided on honesty. "My wife passed away here 5 years ago. The care she received, the dedication of the staff, it meant everything. I've spent my life making money, Ms. Chen. Now, I'd like to do something that matters." Sarah studied him for a long moment before nodding. "We can start you with patient visits, keeping company with those who don't get many visitors. It's simple but meaningful work. Would that interest you?" Robert thought of his empty penthouse, of evenings spent staring at city lights and drinking expensive scotch alone. "Yes," he said, "yes, it would." The training was surprisingly rigorous. Robert, used to being the most knowledgeable person in any room, found himself stumbling through basic protocols and procedures. His fellow volunteers, mostly college students and retired teachers, treated him with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. He was clearly a fish out of water, but for the first time in years, he felt something stirring inside him. The challenge of learning something new, of being useful in a way that had nothing to do with market shares or profit margins. His first day on the floor was a humbling experience. The hospital's long corridors felt different from this side of things. No longer was he a prestigious visitor or worried family member. Now he was part of the system, however minor his role. His first assignment was simple: visit with George Martinez, an elderly patient in the long-term care ward who rarely received visitors. Robert found room 412 easily enough, but hesitated at the door. What would he say? How could he? Robert Thompson, who had spent his life in boardrooms and luxury hotels. Connect with this stranger? Before he could overthink it further, a nurse brushed past him with a warm smile. "Are you the new volunteer?" she asked. "George has been waiting all morning. He loves meeting new people." Taking a deep breath, Robert stepped into the room. The first thing he noticed was the window, large and bright, with a view of the city skyline he knew so well. Then he saw George, a thin man with sharp eyes and a shock of white hair, sitting up in bed with a book in his lap. "Well, well," George said, his voice stronger than his fragile appearance suggested. "They told me they were sending someone new, but they didn't mention they were sending a man who looks as lost as I feel." The honest observation, delivered with a hint of humor, caught Robert off guard. He found himself chuckling as he took the chair beside the bed. "That obvious, is it? Son, I've spent enough time in this room to read people pretty well," George replied, setting his book aside. "You've got that look of someone who's searching for something. Pull up that chair and tell me what brings a man in expensive loafers to volunteer at a hospital." Robert glanced down at his shoes. Italian leather, more expensive than he'd realized might be appropriate, and felt a flush of embarrassment. But when he met George's eyes, he saw no judgment, only genuine curiosity and perhaps a hint of amusement. And so, sitting in that sunlit room with the city sprawling beyond the window, Robert Thompson began to talk, really talk, in a way he hadn't in years. About Margaret, about his retirement, about the emptiness of his perfectly appointed penthouse. George listened with the patience of someone who had learned that time was the most valuable currency of all. When Robert finally fell silent, George nodded slowly. "You know what your problem is?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. "You've spent your life making investments in everything except what really matters." "And what's that?" Robert asked, genuinely curious. "The heart, my friend. The heart." George picked up his book again, a well-worn copy of The Great Gatsby. "Now, since you're here, how about you help an old man with his daily reading? My eyes aren't what they used to be." As Robert took the book, settling into the chair for what would become the first of many reading sessions, he felt something shift inside him. It was subtle, like the first ray of dawn breaking through a long night, but it was there, a warmth, a purpose, a connection he hadn't even realized he was missing. Little did he know that this was just the beginning of a journey that would transform not only his life, but the lives of countless others in ways he could never have imagined. Over the next few weeks, Robert's visits with George became the highlight of his days. The sterile hospital room transformed into a sanctuary of sorts, where titles and wealth meant nothing compared to the simple pleasure of shared stories and genuine conversation. One particularly bright morning, Robert arrived to find George looking through an old leather wallet, photographs spread across his blanket like fallen autumn leaves. Each one seemed to capture a moment frozen in time, snapshots of a life well lived, though perhaps not in the conventional sense. "Ah, Robert," George smiled, his weathered hands carefully gathering the photos. "Perfect timing. I was just taking a trip down memory lane. Care to join me?" Robert settled into his usual chair, noticing how George's hands trembled slightly as he held up a faded photograph of a young couple standing in front of a modest diner. "That's Gloria and me, 1962, he said, his voice soft with remembrance. "We owned that little place for 30 years. Nothing fancy, but we served the best apple pie in Brooklyn, Gloria's secret recipe." "You owned a diner?" Robert asked, surprised. In all their conversations, George had never mentioned this. "The Happy Fork," George chuckled. "Terrible name, but Gloria insisted. Said it made people smile just saying it." She was right, as usual. His expression clouded slightly. "Lost her to cancer in '89. Never could bring myself to run the place without her. Sold it to a developer who turned it into one of those trendy coffee shops." Robert felt a sudden chill. "Was this on Bedford Avenue? Near the corner of 7th? George's eyes sharpened. "You know it. I was involved in that development project, Robert admitted, his throat tightening. Thompson Industries purchased several properties in that area for commercial redevelopment. I never knew... I didn't handle the individual acquisitions personally, but the silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush them both. George stared at the photograph for a long moment before carefully placing it back in his wallet. "Life has a funny way of coming full circle, doesn't it?" he finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "George, I'm so sorry. If I had known..." "Known what?" George interrupted, not unkindly. That behind every property deal, there were real people with real stories. That's business, Robert. The question is, what do you know now? The weight of those words hit Robert like a physical blow. How many other Georges had there been? How many lives had been disrupted or forever altered by decisions he'd made from the comfortable distance of his corner office? "I've been thinking," Robert said slowly, "about making some changes to my charitable foundation. Instead of just writing checks, maybe we could do more. Create programs to help small business owners, preserve historic neighborhoods." George's eyes twinkled. "Now that sounds like an investment worth making. But first, help an old man with his lunch, would you? This hospital food isn't getting any better, and these shaking hands of mine make eating soup an adventure I'd rather avoid." As Robert helped George with his meal, he noticed things he hadn't before. How the tremors in his hands seemed worse than previous weeks. How he had to pause for breath more frequently between bites. When the nurse came in to check George's vitals, Robert stepped into the hallway and found himself face to face with Dr. Sarah Chen, the volunteer coordinator. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her expression serious, "I'm glad I caught you. Do you have a moment?" They moved to a quiet corner of the hallway, where Dr. Chen's professional demeanor softened slightly. "I wanted to talk to you about George. His condition is deteriorating faster than we anticipated. The cancer has spread, and..." "Cancer?" Robert interrupted. "He never mentioned..." "He was diagnosed shortly before you started volunteering. Refused further treatment. Said he'd rather spend his remaining time having meaningful conversations than fighting a losing battle in the oncology ward." She paused, studying Robert's shocked expression. "He hasn't told you any of this, has he?" Robert shook his head, feeling as if the floor had suddenly disappeared beneath his feet. All these weeks of conversations, of sharing stories and wisdom, and George had never once mentioned he was dying. How long?" Robert managed to ask. "Weeks, maybe less. Mr. Thompson." "Robert, I know this is difficult, but George speaks so highly of your visits. Whatever time he has left..." "I'll be here," Robert said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "Every day, if he'll have me." Returning to George's room, Robert found him dozing, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across his peaceful face. The photograph of the happy fork had slipped from his wallet onto the blanket. Robert carefully picked it up, studying the young couple's bright, hopeful faces. In that moment, he made a decision that would set in motion events he could never have anticipated. Later that evening, in his penthouse office, Robert made a series of phone calls. His lawyers were confused by his urgent requests, his business managers skeptical of his plans. But he pressed forward with the determination that had made him successful in business. If he could build an empire out of steel and glass, surely he could rebuild one small piece of Brooklyn's heart. As he worked late into the night, Robert remembered something George had said weeks ago. The measure of a man isn't in how much he has, but in how much he gives when giving isn't easy. At the time, Robert had thought he understood. Now, watching the city lights flicker beyond his window, he realized he was just beginning to learn what those words truly meant. The next morning, when Robert arrived at the hospital, he carried with him not just his usual companionship, but the seeds of a plan that would either be his greatest achievement or his most humbling failure. Either way, he knew it was time to start making different kinds of investments, the kind that wouldn't show up on any balance sheet, but might just help restore something precious that had been lost. The original location of the Happy Fork was now an artisanal coffee shop called The Daily Grind. its sleek, modern exterior a stark contrast to the worn photograph George kept in his wallet. Robert stood outside, ignoring the curious glances from hipster patrons as he studied the building. His real estate team had confirmed what he already knew. Buying this property would be complicated, expensive, and possibly futile. "Mr. Thompson?" A young woman in a business suit approached, clutching a leather portfolio. "I'm Amanda Chen from the Foundation. You wanted to discuss the Neighborhood Preservation Initiative?" Robert nodded, noticing with surprise that she shared the same surname as Dr. Chen from the hospital. "Any relation to Dr. Sarah Chen?" "My sister," Amanda smiled. "She mentioned you were one of her most dedicated volunteers, though she didn't mention you were planning something like this." They spent the next hour walking the neighborhood, Amanda pointing out other properties Thompson Industries had developed over the years. Each storefront told a similar story: local businesses replaced by chain stores, family restaurants transformed into trendy boutiques. Progress, Robert had called it once. Now he saw it differently. "The property owner isn't interested in selling," Amanda reported, consulting her notes. "But I had another thought. The building next door is vacant, and it actually has more historical significance. It was originally a famous jazz club in the 1940s before becoming a diner in the 50s. Robert felt a spark of hope. "Can you get me everything you have on that property? And Amanda, let's keep this between us for now. I don't want to get anyone's hopes up." Back at the hospital, Robert found George having a difficult day. His breathing was labored, and the tremors in his hands were worse than ever. Still, his eyes lit up when Robert entered. "You're late today, big shot," George teased weakly. "Finally remember you have a real life outside these walls." Robert settled into his chair, noticing how the afternoon sun cast harsh shadows on George's gaunt face. "Actually, I've been working on something. A surprise. At my age, surprises usually involve doctors with bad news." George chuckled, then winced. "But go on. Distract an old man from his aches and pains." Instead, Robert picked up their current book. They'd moved on from Gatsby to Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, but George waved him off. "Not today. Today I want to tell you about Gloria's apple pie." For the next hour, George shared the story of how Gloria had perfected her recipe, testing countless variations until she found the perfect balance of tart and sweet. He described the way she'd roll the dough with practiced precision, humming old jazz standards as she worked. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if the memories themselves were medicine. "The secret," George said, his eyes distant with remembrance, "wasn't in the ingredients. It was in the love she put into each pie. Sounds sappy, doesn't it? But it's true. You could taste it in every bite." Robert listened, committing every detail to memory. When George finally exhausted himself talking, falling into a light doze, Robert quietly excused himself and found Dr. Chen at the nurse's station. "How much time?" he asked without preamble. Sarah's professional composure cracked slightly. "Days, maybe. He's declining faster than we expected. The pain management is becoming more challenging." Robert ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of urgency pressing down on him. "I need a favor, Sarah. A big one. And I need you to trust that what I'm asking is important." She studied him carefully before nodding. "What do you need?" The next few days became a blur of activity. Robert divided his time between the hospital and urgent meetings with his foundation team. Amanda worked tirelessly, navigating property laws and zoning regulations, while Robert made calls to expedite processes that usually took months. During his hospital visits, Robert noticed George sleeping more, speaking less. But when he was awake, his mind remained sharp as ever. One afternoon, as Robert helped him sip water through a straw, George fixed him with a penetrating gaze. "You're up to something," he stated. "I can tell. You have that same look you described getting before big business deals." Robert adjusted George's pillows, buying time to consider his response. "Would it bother you if I was?" "Depends," George replied. "Is it something that's going to make you richer, or something that's going to make you better?" The question hit home with surprising force. "I'm hoping both, in a way, just not the kind of richness I used to chase." George nodded slowly, seeming to understand more than Robert had said. Good. That's good. He closed his eyes, his energy flagging. Robert, whatever it is you're planning, don't wait too long. Time has a way of running out when you least expect it. That evening, Robert received 2 calls. The first was from Amanda. They'd secured the property, and the expedited permits had been approved. The second was from Dr. Chen. George had taken a turn for the worse. Racing to the hospital well after visiting hours, Robert found Sarah waiting for him. "He's been asking for you," she said softly. "We've made him as comfortable as possible, but..." Robert entered the dimly lit room, where George lay, propped up on pillows, his breathing shallow but steady. The machines around him beeped softly, marking time in steady electronic pulses. "You made it," George whispered, his voice barely audible. "Good. I didn't want to leave without saying goodbye properly." "Don't talk like that," Robert said, taking his seat beside the bed. "Save your strength. I have something to show you tomorrow." George's lips curved in a weak smile. "Tomorrow's a gift, not a guarantee, my friend. But I want you to know something." He reached out with a trembling hand, which Robert carefully took in his own. "These past months, you came here thinking you were helping a lonely old man. But the truth is, you're the one who needed saving. And watching you change, watching you learn to see the world differently, that's been my final gift to the world." Robert spent the night in the hospital room, dozing fitfully in the uncomfortable chair, while nurses came and went like silent shadows. Around dawn, he was startled awake by George's voice, stronger than it had been in days. "Gloria?" George called out, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. "Gloria, is that your pie I smell?" Robert pressed the call button, and Dr. Chen arrived quickly, checking George's vitals. "He's experiencing what we call terminal lucidity," she explained quietly. "Sometimes near the end, patients have a period of unusual clarity or energy. It doesn't usually last long." "Then we need to move fast," Robert said, pulling out his phone. "Sarah, I need your help with something crazy." An hour later, the peaceful morning routine of the hospital floor was disrupted by an unusual procession. Amanda Chen led the way, carrying folders and looking professionally anxious. Behind her came an older woman with grey hair tied back in a neat bun, followed by 2 men carrying what looked like restaurant equipment. "Mr. Thompson," Amanda began, "we really shouldn't be doing this. The liability alone..." "You shall take full responsibility," Robert interrupted, then turned to the older woman. "Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for coming on such short notice." Rosa Rodriguez had owned a bakery in Brooklyn for 40 years before retiring. She'd been skeptical when Robert's foundation contacted her the previous week, but something about the urgency in his voice had convinced her. "You have the recipe?" she asked. Robert handed her the notes he'd taken during George's detailed description of Gloria's apple pie. Rosa studied them, nodding slowly. "It's close to my own grandmother's recipe, with these modifications." She looked around the room, taking in the medical equipment and George's sleeping form. "You understand this is highly unusual?" "Please," Robert said simply. "It's important." While Dr. Chen coordinated with the nursing staff to ensure their unusual activity wouldn't interfere with patient care, Rosa and her assistants set up a small portable cooking station in a nearby conference room. The smell of butter and cinnamon soon filled the air. George woke again as the morning sun streamed through his window. "Robert," he called weakly, "is this real or am I dreaming? I smell..." "Just hold on a little longer," Robert said, squeezing his friend's hand. "I have something to show you first." He pulled out his tablet and pulled up a series of photographs. "Remember that building next to the Happy Fork? The old jazz club?" George nodded slightly, his eyes focusing on the screen. "The Thompson Foundation just purchased it," Robert continued. "We're converting it into a community center with a teaching kitchen and small business incubator. The centerpiece will be a restaurant called Gloria's Place." He swiped through architectural renderings showing a warm, inviting space that somehow captured the spirit of the diner in George's old photograph while adding modern touches. "The mission is to help preserve neighborhood businesses and teach young entrepreneurs. Each year, we'll provide grants and mentoring to help local residents start their own restaurants or food-related businesses. Robert's voice grew thick with emotion. And every Friday, we'll serve apple pie, made with this recipe. He held up a leather-bound notebook where Rosa had carefully transcribed the recipe, along with George's stories about Gloria and the happy fork. Your legacy, George, your and Gloria's, making sure the heart of the neighborhood keeps beating. Tears rolled down George's weathered cheeks. You did all this for an old man's memories. No, Robert replied softly. I did it because you taught me what really matters, about investing in people, in communities, in the things that make life worth living. You showed me that true wealth isn't about what you have, but about what you give back. At that moment, Rosa entered the room carrying a pie, its golden brown crust still warm from the oven. The aroma of baked apples and cinnamon filled the small space, and George's eyes widened. Would you like to taste it? Robert asked. Rosa's been working all morning to recreate Gloria's recipe. With trembling hands and Robert's help, George managed a small bite. His eyes closed, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away from his face. When he opened them again, they were bright with tears and memory. Gloria, he whispered. It tastes just like Gloria's. George passed away peacefully that evening, with Robert by his side. In his final moments, he drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking to Gloria as if she were in the room, other times offering fragments of wisdom to Robert in his increasingly fragile voice. His last words were, remember, the heart's investment always pays the best dividends. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as Robert threw himself into the Gloria's Place project with an intensity that surprised even his closest advisors. He personally interviewed architects who could preserve the building's historical character while making it functional for its new purpose. He spent hours with Amanda Chen and her team, developing programs that would help small business owners navigate the challenges he had once placed in their paths. One morning, as construction crews began work on the building, Robert received an unexpected visitor at his penthouse. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived carrying a small box. We found these while clearing out George's room, she explained, placing the box on Robert's desk. He left specific instructions that they should go to you. Inside, Robert found George's worn wallet, the photograph of the happy fork still tucked inside. There was also a handwritten letter, the paper yellowed with age, written in a delicate feminine hand. It was from Gloria to George, dated just weeks before her death. My dearest George, the letter began, when I'm gone, don't let your heart close with the diner's doors. There's so much love still left to give, so many lives you could touch. Promise me you'll find a way to keep our spirit of hospitality alive. Robert's vision blurred as he read Gloria's final wishes to her husband. All those years George had carried this letter, waiting for the right moment, the right person to help fulfill his wife's last request. Somehow, through what had seemed like chance, Robert had become that person. 6 months later, Gloria's Place opened its doors. The space was everything Robert had envisioned and more. The main restaurant area featured photographs of old Brooklyn establishments, including a prominent place for the picture of young George and Gloria in front of the happy fork. The teaching kitchen gleamed with new equipment, while the business center provided modern resources for aspiring entrepreneurs. But the heart of the place was a small corner booth, designated as George and Gloria's table. Above it hung a beautifully framed recipe card for Gloria's apple pie, alongside a plaque that read, "The greatest investment we can make is in each other's dreams." On opening day, Robert stood back and watched as the first class of small business grant recipients toured the facility. They were a diverse group, young chefs, immigrant restaurateurs, family bakers, each carrying dreams as big as the ones George and Gloria had once held. Sarah and Amanda Chen were there too, having become not just partners in the project, but friends. You know, Sarah said, watching Robert greet each participant personally, when you first showed up in my office as a volunteer, I never imagined it would lead to this. Neither did I, Robert admitted. Robert, I thought I was just looking for a way to fill empty hours. Instead, I found a purpose. Later that evening, after the crowds had gone and the lights were dimmed, Robert sat alone in George and Gloria's booth. He took out the old photograph from George's wallet, now carefully preserved in a new frame, and propped it on the table. "Well, my friends," he said softly, "we did it. Your legacy lives on, not just in apple pies and old recipes, but in the dreams you're helping to make possible." He could almost hear George's response. Not bad for a retired millionaire who didn't know what to do with himself. The next morning, Robert was back at Mount Sinai Hospital wearing his volunteer badge. There were other George out there, people with stories to tell, wisdom to share, and hearts full of dreams yet to be fulfilled. His own heart, once focused solely on financial investments, had learned to invest in something far more valuable. The power of human connection. As he walked the familiar hospital corridors, Robert remembered something George had told him during one of their first meetings. The secret to a rich life isn't in the money you make, but in the differences you make. Looking back, he realized that what had started as a simple attempt to fill empty hours had become a profound lesson in the true meaning of wealth. The Thompson Foundation continued to expand its community investment programs, with Gloria's Place serving as a model for similar projects in other neighborhoods. Each one preserved local histories while nurturing future dreams, creating spaces where the past and present could meet in harmony. But for Robert, the greatest wealth remained in the simple acts of service, reading to patients, sharing conversations, and yes, occasionally bringing them a slice of apple pie made from Gloria's recipe. Because in the end, George had been right all along. The heart's investment was the only one that truly mattered. And somewhere he liked to think George and Gloria were together again, watching over their legacy as it touched life after life, one slice of pie, one dream, one heart at a time. Has this story touched your heart? We'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment in this journey moved you the most? Was it a particular conversation, a revelation, or perhaps that final act of kindness that changed everything? Have you ever experienced a moment that completely transformed your perspective on life? Just like our protagonist. Share your story with us in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. What would you have done in this situation? Sometimes the smallest choices lead to the most profound changes in our lives. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel, think, or see life differently even for a moment, please consider supporting our channel with a like and subscription. Your support isn't just a click, it's what allows us to keep finding and sharing these powerful stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Look to your left. See that video? It carries another extraordinary journey that will touch your soul just as deeply. A story that will remind you once again why we're all connected in this beautiful tapestry of life. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Every day, we search for stories that can change hearts and open minds. Stories that remind us of the extraordinary power of human connection. With your subscription, you're not just following a channel. You're joining a community of people who believe in the power of storytelling to make our world a little bit better, one heart at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for letting these stories touch your heart. And thank you for helping us continue to share these moments that remind us all of what truly matters in life. Don't forget to hit that notification bell to ensure you never miss another story that could change your perspective forever.